Well, welcome, Priya Sharma.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, Priya is an award-winning horror writer, and thanks for coming here today. She's also won a couple of big awards. Just to get my notes, it's 2016 the British Fantasy Awards for Fabulous Beasts, and 2018 the Shirley Jackson Award for All the Fabulous Beasts, slightly different. I know we spoke about this before, but do you actually get a physical award when you get these awards?
We do it, yeah, which is very, very nice. I've got them over on my little shelf over there. So yeah. We do. We get like if you can't go to the award, normally the award ceremony, normally they send it out to you in the post, which is lovely. Yeah, so it's quite nice.
And how does it work? Do they tell you that you're shortlisted or anything like that, or does it just come straight out of the blue?
Normally, there's the whole process for all of these awards. Generally, is that a shortlist is released.
Hmm.
Um, and then depending on, because some of the awards have a jury panel. Well, a lot of them have a jury panel now. So once you know you're on that shortlist, you know who'll be looking at those stories or that novel or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and there's normally for all the big awards, except during COVID, there is an award ceremony. So if you're lucky enough to be able to travel to those, it's quite nice because you get there to be there on the night. You're never told in advance
Yeah.
um, whether you've won or not. So it's quite exciting, really. It's
Hmm.
probably the closest I get to that sort of glitzy kind of thing. Everyone sort of turns up and like, has a little bit of paper in their pocket, and I've had a few drinks before, so it's a bit of an event, really. It's nice.
Excellent. Well, growing up, you got into sort of well, about you got into writing sort of because of your love of reading. Is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah. And were
Yeah.
your family quite supportive of that?
Oh, totally, totally. I mean, I'm that generation of public libraries.
Hmm.
And, my mum has always been a voracious reader. So part of the week would be her going to the library to get a book for herself.
Yeah.
And, it was the same for us, just go and get yourself some books. And there was no kind of censorship, no sense of kids' books or adult books. Just go off and get what you like the look of.
Hmm.
And books were a treat, books in the house were always like not sacred objects, but loved objects. And, I remember my mum buying me my first sort of set of Daphne du Maurier books, things like
Hmm.
classics like Rebecca and things like that. So yeah, always surrounded by sort of stories, not just books, but film as well.
Hmm.
My mum was a massive kind of Hitchcock fan, and I inherited that love of Hitchcock and grew up in the 70s. So it was stuff like Armchair Thriller. I don't know if you remember that.
I do,
A
yeah.
very Yeah, a very sort of dark kind of TV series for people who didn't know it, and it was all based around sort of crime, very dark crime and ghost stories, and had a very dark edge to it. So yeah, and things like obviously Doctor Who. I was kind of the Tom Baker generation,
Yeah.
um, that kind of thing. So yeah, always surrounded by stories, definitely.
Right. Speaking of the 70s, I was going to bring this up actually. So we were surrounded by some really dark subject matter, weren't we? Because I grew up in the 70s as well. And so it was things like the Tales of the Unexpected, Armchair Thriller, like you said. Yeah. And I used
Yeah.
to watch this stuff and it was terrifying. I don't know if it's, but some of the stuff like even the kids' films like Watership Down.
Oh, do you know what? Watch it down as a kid, and I remember reading that for the first time, and in hindsight, I mean, it's fascinating because it's visceral, isn't it?
Hmm.
But it's that lovely marriage of suspension of disbelief stacked up against realism.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so for me, that was quite something else. And I think we're also the generation of things like Charlie Says. You remember the
Hmm.
advertising campaign, the public information films. There was danger around every corner. Don't go swimming in flooded quarries. That kind of thing. And Threads. Do you remember
Yeah.
seeing the film about kind of the post-apocalyptic nuclear explosion in Britain? So the world was definitely coming to an end imminently. So yeah, it was quite a dark period, I think. But exciting as well because I don't think I think we were all that generation that just got chucked outside to go and, explore those flooded quarries and, do what we wanted to do. And there's a certain amount of freedom as
Yeah.
well.
It's funny as well because yeah, I mean the public information films that was on my list to talk about as well. So things like Dark Water, where there was a Grim Reaper stalking kids around ponds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's a
Yeah,
different,
definitely.
yeah,
Do you like Scarfolk?
yes, yeah,
I don't know if you've seen the kind of the Scarfolk annual and their website, which kind of references in quite a funny way that whole period of the public information film. And interestingly, there was a really good exhibition a couple of years ago about sort of horror through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which heavily down in Somerset House in London,
yeah.
which referenced kind of threads in those public information films. And also interesting politically, things like the Maggie Thatcher puppet of what was it called? The satire with a
Oh, Spitting Image.
spitting image, but the darker sort of side of that.
Yeah,
It sort of tapped into all of that, which I thought was interesting. I think there's a whole generation of us who have been informed by that.
yeah. I mean, even kids shows such as I don't know if you remember Children of the Stones as well.
Mm, yeah, very much so. And even some of the bizarre kind of series that we got from Europe as well, kids programs.
Hmm.
But there was also things like I don't know if you remember Christopher Jones who wrote The Death of Grass, the really great kind of post-apocalypse novel.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Um, John Christopher, apologies. He was doing kind of kids series as well that were really interesting. So yeah, definitely,
yeah.
yeah. There was a lot of darkness in kids' telly
So,
when you think about it.
so what made you want to become a doctor? Because you had an interest in science, didn't you? Quite early
Yeah,
on.
I mean, I think I was very fortunate in that I went to an all-girls comprehensive school.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of freedom if you were interested in maths and science and physics. Great teachers, but it had a great English department as well. So I kind of loved both.
Hmm.
And I don't know. I think for me, medicine. I kind of I wanted. I think there's lots of complicated reasons why I did it.
Yeah.
Um, Ranging from a long degree where I could leave home, and I was in those halcyon days of being able to get full grants. I qualified for a full grant, no
Hmm.
course fees, opportunities that aren't given to kids today.
Yeah.
Um, so I was able to go off to university for a very long period. So yes, for me, wanting to be independent as early as possible and have um, a job that would sustain me for my whole life, that would interest me,
Yeah.
um, that was important. But I couldn't really let go of my love of books.
Yeah.
I just I mean, I remember as a medical student in my first year, going to Blackwell's, the bookshop, to see Clive Barker and Ramsey Campbell speak. So it was fortunate I was around in that time to be able to, when people like that were still kind of accessible.
Hmm.
Clive, I took my copy of Weave World and the Books of Blood, and it was really exciting. But then in the same time, I did the old medical course, which is a little bit different to now, where we spent the first couple of years studying physiology and anatomy. So we kind of were locked for part of the year in a dissecting lab with a cadaver, and learnt dissection. So there was lots of things about that period that I remember that were really exciting.
Hmm. It took a while, didn't it, for you to start actually writing? When did you decide that? I mean, obviously we know exactly when you decided it, but was there a lead up to it though?
I wrote a lot of really awful shit in my
Right.
20s, and I loved Carter, and I remember writing these awful pastiches of Angela Carter and just wanting to write the way that she made me feel.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of trial and error, and I almost taught myself out of that. And when I was studying for my degree and then my postgraduate, exams and things like that, I felt like I couldn't devote any time to it, even though I read a lot. But I think as I pushed towards 40, I suddenly thought, what am I? Why am I putting this off? What am I scared of?
Yeah.
And if I don't do it now,
Mm.
then when? What are we waiting for in life to do the things that we want to try? And that wasn't with any great ambition or thinking that it would be any good. And in fact, it was pretty terrible for a long time. I mean, I didn't do any kind of formal writing classes or education. It was just using what I'd read and a lot of trial and error and writing 30 or 40 drafts of awful short stories and redrafting them till I learned what I needed to do to make them look how I wanted them to look. I mean, I think the problem is when you learn to write, all you see of other writers is the pristine text.
Yeah.
So you don't appreciate the graft that 90% of us have to go through to get to that final version of something. It was this arcane sort of mysterious process. And, I had no idea how to sort of access that space and do it. And it was trial and error, really, a lot of trial and error. And it wasn't really till quite late that I started publishing short stories very, very slowly in very little magazines.
What magazine did you approach first? Where did you get your first break into magazines?
It was actually a very little magazine called Dark Tales who would, and I know a lot of people say don't enter anything where you have to pay, but it was like £2.50 or £4 or £5 to enter their little annual, so their sort of bi-monthly competition. So I started entering those and kind of getting further and further up, until eventually, if I got in the top three, I was really happy because it meant I got like a tenner or something. Or I think if you like got first place, you got £20 or something like that. But it sort of gave me confidence to keep trying, and then slightly larger magazines picked things up. So I know the common popular thought is go for the biggest pay markets first.
Yeah.
And then work your way down. But I actually didn't do that. When I started to write what I thought were better stories, I went for the kind of magazines that I thought were nicely produced and had stories in that I really enjoyed reading that I might get a look in.
Yeah.
And from there, gradually worked my way up. And then kind of there was an Irish magazine who started to take a couple of my stories and they got selected. They're not around anymore, but then Ellen Datlow, because I knew she read that, and I don't know if you know Ellen Datlow, the American anthologist. For people who aren't aware, she's an anthologist who does a great annual best of, but also does original story anthologies. I knew that though that magazine went across her desk. And when she very kindly started to use my stories in her annual best ofs, that opened a lot of doors for me because I could put on my very short intros, submission cover letters I've appeared in, and that people started taking me more seriously. And then came Black Static, which is sadly not around anymore, which was under the Third Alternative Press, along with Interzone. So then I started to get stories into their pages, which was a huge deal for me because I loved how much money they spent on artwork and layout and non-fiction. They reviewed books, they reviewed film. They had great little editorials at the start, from people like Stephen Volk and Aaliyah Whiteley. And Ellen then started to pick up stories for tour.com, which is now Reactor, which was like obviously a big platform for me as as someone who's quite small beans and just a short story writer. It afforded me quite a wide coverage, so I was very lucky, really.
Why do you think you gravitate towards short stories instead of massive novels?
I think possibly a short attention span. which but I personally love the form, and I didn't realize I loved the form when I started writing it. And it's that, I mean, it's a load of rubbish when they say, oh, learn to write a short story so you can write novels. And I think I was when I started kicking that around, I thought that was the thing to do. But I actually disagree with that, because they are very, very different forms. And I think,
Yeah.
and I've always, I always think that the brevity of a well-written short story has more to do with poetry than it does with the novel. And I find myself now getting quite impatient with those massive, like, trilogies, when I think I just want to trim this down. So I think my natural thing is to make things more concise, to make things shorter, pack in as much story as you can, but do it in a really concise way. And it's great because after 3 or 4 months, or however long something takes me, I can switch up ideas and move on to something else. I
Yeah.
love the short story form. I mean, it's not what it was. It's not the massive paying thing that it used to be. In the heyday of, say, Playboy in the 60s and 70s, when they were publishing Stephen King, and
Mm.
when you think of like major, like, newspapers carrying short stories, obviously they don't, that market isn't there anymore. I think we've been replaced by the podcast
Yeah.
and things like that, haven't we? But as a form, I still stand by it.
Yeah.
I think a good short story, word for word, is a very precious thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was reading one of your books, and it did strike me that you were very similar in a lot of ways to Clive Barker. I was going to mention that. So I don't know if you,
As a fan of Clive Barker, that's a massive compliment. Thank you.
and also, yeah. So you mentioned the brevity of your the way you write, the economy. I was really impressed by that because, like you said, you can bring over a point in the shortest way possible. I mean, how much time do you take to trim and to make it
Yeah.
concise?
I think I can't remember which writer said it, but and I wish I could. I don't think it was Bell Bainbridge, who's known for writing was known for writing very short novels. But I think somebody said to this writer once, "Why do you write such short work?" And he said, "Because I didn't have time to make it shorter." It does take time to kind of cut out all the flab. And I think you've got to be quite hard with yourself, because you can get very attached to certain phrases and sentences, and the way things are written. And you've got to be quite cruel with the text, I think.
Mm.
I love to make things, because the thing is as well, when you're writing a short story, you are paid by the word. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that. And if you want to make a massive impact with that story, it's either got to be short and exquisite, or if you want to make it, if you can make space for great world building and character building and plot by
Mm.
trimming out all the excess fat, word for word, you're better value for money. And hopefully that will make me a bit more attractive when people are thinking, who do we want to ask to submit to this?
Yeah. How much time do you spend on the actual story before you put it into print? Is it something that you sort of leave it in your head and sort of develop there for a while? How much of the story do you have before you start writing it?
It's interesting because the process, I think, for me has changed, because it all used to be pen and paper, writing down,
Mm.
copying out, and editing as I went. And I think that's changed. And it's interesting because I did a little bit of work with Audible on a project that they did, and there were four of us sat in a room working on developing a whole storyline,
Mm.
and episodes for something. And that actually made me rethink my whole process and about how inefficient it is. And
Yeah.
it's taken me a long time, because I am quite slow, to learn how to shortcut all of that. Because what would have taken me when I started writing a year, I can do maybe in 3 or 4 months now.
Yeah.
And I do value more the work that I'm not doing at the page. And everyone's different. Some people will think it all through and come to the page with a clear line of what they're doing
Mm.
and be able to just set it down. I think I'm half and half.
Hmm.
I don't want to necessarily, I like to discover things as I write as well. So being really tightly plotted, I don't enjoy that either. I like room to move because I will discover things as I'm researching and writing as I'm going along, which is fun as well. I
Yeah.
mean, there's I don't know if you know Sarah Pinsborough's work. She's quite well known, and she's got a new show out called Insomnia. She did something called Behind Her Eyes, which was a novel, and I remember listening to her speak about her process, and she said at one point, all I did that day was go to the pub, and it starts a pot point because it wasn't working on the page. So I went out, sat
Hmm.
and had a drink, and suddenly thought, right, I know how to fix that. But that is work,
Yeah.
and it's sort of acknowledging it as such, because I think there's this fallacy that, and it doesn't work for everybody. Some people love word counts, some
Hmm.
people are driven by word counts, and it's what gets them to the end of a project. But for me, it's not at all. You
Yeah.
know, if you've got to deliver, 5,000 words a day, otherwise you're sunk.
Yeah.
I get pretty dispirited pretty quickly.
Yeah, I find because I write sort of guidebooks, right? So it's non-fiction. But yeah, I find that if you're just not in the mood to write as well, because I've tried that. I've tried, right, I'll do this amount today, and you can tell later when you're reading through it that your heart's not in it. You can tell the quality of the writing's just completely off, and it's a waste of time to do it when you're not, feeling it, basically. So yeah, I agree. People that say you've got to do like so many hours a day, it sort of depends, doesn't it? I mean, you try, but if it's just not working, it reads flat, doesn't it? When you're outside it.
Yeah, and I think everyone's got a different process, and I think the days when your heart's not in it, do something else and make
Yeah.
that okay. Demystify the whole thing. You might be reading something that's research for what you're going to do next. You might just be scene sketching. You might be making notes for your next project. There's ways to keep writing when
Hmm.
you're not inspired. And it's not always about sitting in a room. Sometimes it's going outside
Just do
and just
something
walking
different.
and thinking, yeah, or looking at something different, or going to a gallery, or you know, going for a run if you're that way inclined. Obviously, I'm not, but everyone's different.
Well, you mentioned research. What was the most fun thing you've ever researched for a story?
Oh God, I love researching stuff. I really love researching stuff. I really enjoy it. I did a story on William Blake um, for a horror collection for Ellen Datlow, and it was about monsters. And I was so stuck with it. I didn't want to do vampires. I didn't want to do traditional werewolves. But how could I do an original monster? And I was totally obsessed with his Ghost of the Flea,
Hmm.
which is a tiny little weird painting. But I loved researching that because the whole thing was completely informed by William and Catherine Blake's life. And for him, the ghost of a flea, because he had visions, and he worked with an astrologer and a watercolorist called Varley. And the two of them wrote a book called I think it was Mystical Heads, but he believed that the flea was the soul of dead murderers.
Right.
So, and this sort of generated a whole story based completely on his life. So I loved doing that. I also really enjoyed doing an Alice in Wonderland story, and I'm not a massive Alice in Wonderland fan, but the moment I realised what I wanted to do, because I wanted to write about hat making and mercury poisoning, because mercury poisoning was because hatters needed it to work the pelt to transform the
Um,
bee pelt into something they could make top hats out of, but they all got poisoned by
right.
it, and it creates a very peculiar sort of psychosis. So I wanted to write about that, but in terms of Alice in Wonderland. So I went to the Stockport Hat Museum because that was the kind of biggest centre of hat making in the UK in its time. And that was just fascinating. I mean, hat makers, they realised mercury was useful because the hat makers who had syphilis
Right.
and were being treated with mercury, because they used urine in the process, their own urine,
Hmm.
made better hats.
Oh.
So they discovered that mercury was the way forward. And it was fascinating how it transformed from a cottage industry into this big industrial factory based machine. So I wanted to explore that as well, you know, sort of socially and politically, and women's roles in that. So yeah, I loved doing that. I wrote a story in my own steampunk version of Liverpool. Again, did Liverpool, kind of I live on the Wirral, so very close to Liverpool. So I did a lot of research around Liverpool, the industrial Liverpool, and the courts where people lived. In very cramped, closed conditions, and that again, research really excites me because it informs language. It takes you off in a completely different direction. You know, what I would say is don't do all your research and then sit down either. You know, start your story and do it on the fly, because then you can start to bring in all these elements that you're learning about.
Yeah. Going back to the hat thing, is that where the Mad Hatter came from?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the Mad Hatter was based on because in my story, he's a hatter who's in debtor's prison, but he has gone mad from the mercury poisoning. But mercury poison actually creates a very different character to the one that that Lewis Carroll wrote.
Yeah.
You know, they're not these big verbose characters. They're actually very withdrawn. They've got a psychosis where they kind of feel like things are crawling on the skin. They get social withdrawal. You know, it's very distressing. It's a really distressing condition. And there's a great article in it in the British Medical Journal that I referenced. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Mad Hatter was very much my way into that, and it was a really great collection because all the stories took a different aspect of the books.
A lot of your protagonists, the sort of they're outsiders, aren't they? I would say, and sometimes they're not very nice people either. I don't know if that's if you agree with that. Not all of them, but you know, there seems to be sort of a trend towards that. Is that something conscious that you do?
No, I just think we're complicated, aren't we? We've all got elements of our personality that aren't very nice, and we've all got redeeming features. And I hope nothing is black and white in this world. I think we've all got capacity on a shitty day to do things that
Yeah.
aren't so nice, and I think life bends some people out of shape, doesn't it?
Mm.
You know, it's not just nature; it's nurture as well. And I guess I find those sort of people, I guess, more interesting. I'm not saying I necessarily want them in my life, but to write about. I think, you know, I've never really been interested in the hero.
Yeah.
Unless he's got feet of clay, because I just don't find that very realistic.
Yeah. Hmm.
I'm not interested in the psychology of those. You know, I'm interested in the psychology of people who are damaged. As someone
Yeah.
who's damaged myself, I think, you know, we've all got our things that we carry and our things that we're not so good at, and I don't think anyone's. You know, I think if you scratch the search list of anyone, there's difficulty and there's pain and in different ways, and that's what interests me, I think, in life.
Yeah. There's been a tendency in media really to sort of take because we used to have proper monsters, didn't we, in the 70s and 80s, and I think they're trying to humanize things like well, monsters in general. So you've got things like Twilight, which have
Yeah.
got sort of very humanized vampires and things like that. What would you think about that? Do you think that's true? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think the otherness of monsters is interesting, and I love the parallel that the monster, to use the monster to look at ourselves is interesting. That interests me more, I think, than the straightforward, you know, kind of Godzilla type trope or werewolves. Or I mean, my favorite vampire movie, I mean, I think there's a difference between humanizing and romanticizing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, obviously, I mean, I'm not a lover of sort of the Twilight films. No disrespect to anyone who is. If that's your bag, that's great. The vampire film that I loved the most was Let the Right One In.
Ah, I've not actually
The
seen that.
original. Oh my God, Sean, just tell me what you think of it if you ever get to see it.
Yeah.
But as a story of you know, it's about this little boy in Sweden. His parents are split up. He's very isolated. He's bullied, and a man moves in next door with a little girl.
Hmm.
It's no spoiler to say that this little girl isn't what she seems.
That's right.
And it's a beautiful portrait of adolescence, but it's also about power and love and manipulation, and there's real sort of peril in it, but as kind of an exploration of how we can be. It's a really really interesting film in terms of how she kind of wins him over and sort of saves him in all the ways, but the end is very chilling because it moves to a place where you can see the whole of his future mapped out ahead of him and what he's going to be to her and what's going to happen to him at the end.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, the role of the monster and how we explore being human interests me more. The otherness and the outsider and our own flaws. So I wouldn't say from the romantic point of view. Interestingly, I've never seen Dexter. That's on my
Oh,
my
that's really good.
my list to see as a serial killer of serial killers and how he is the protagonist. So that's something that I'm interested to see. Personally, I think as someone sort of who grew up in a very sort of white middle class Cheshire town, I think I always felt a little bit outside, but I
Yeah.
was inside as well. And just that outsider part of me always found those monster stories very interesting, I think. And
Yeah.
especially as they progressed into an exploration of what it is like to be others. I think that's something Angela Carter did very well in terms of her monsters in, for example, The Bloody Chamber. I
Yeah.
think, I don't know if you read The Tiger's Bride, a short story in there, which is Beauty and the Beast, but, without adding, again, trying not to add spoilers, but I always, and I've written about this in very short things, short essays and things, but how the monster then becomes human and beautiful always seemed wrong to me. It always seemed like, well, if you loved him, why did he need to change?
Yeah.
And what was wrong with him the way that he was? And I think that sort of explored that whole idea of monstrous very well. It upended the whole thing for me.
Yeah. A lot of these stories deal with change and sort of rebirth and transformation, sometimes actually literally transformation. Do you think that's important in a story to see that development of a character like that?
Yeah, I don't think it's always essential, because I think I'm trying to think of an example of a short story where the character hasn't changed, but maybe the reader's perception of the world has. But for me, I always want to go on a journey, I think.
Yeah.
And sometimes that transformation, I think the thing is my collection that a lot of these stories are in are probably only about half of what I've published, but the editor picked those very deliberately, so it's quite a tight collection from that point of
So,
view.
yeah.
So they all have that kind of thread running through it. But I think in terms of sort of transformation, I love the idea for a lot of them, even though they're becoming quite monstrous, they're coming to their own and they're learning something about themselves, and they're sloughing off the past, and they know that where they were isn't where they needed to be in life. So
Yeah.
sometimes that transformation, although it is literal, is about getting where we need to be, I think. So I hope there's a lot of hope in it as well.
Yeah. Oh, there always is, I think, when I've read your stuff. What have you got against cats?
Cats.
There's
I'm not.
a few
I'm not
stories
anti.
where
Yeah, yeah. I'm not anti-cat, but I'm definitely team bird.
oh, right, yeah.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is a story called the Crow Palace, isn't it? And at one
Yeah.
point, there's a cat who's captured a bird on the lawn and is mobbed by a load of birds. Yeah, I mean, I've got a big outside the window here. I've got a big feeding station for the birds, and we have cats who do lurk around. So yeah, I have to admit, I am team bird. Don't dislike cats. Would never harm a cat. Just I think I'm probably more team bird than or dog even. Um, yeah. I mean, the hunters. It's in their nature. You can't blame them. But I do like to see my little baby starlings get
Yeah.
away.
Well, we talked about this earlier, but I just want to bring it up again. So, you've got no formal training in writing. You've never sort of gone a course or anything like that. Do you think that's a good thing in terms of originality and that sort of thing?
It's taken me a lot longer to learn to write because I think there's probably a whole shed load of technical skills
Hmm.
that I haven't got, and I am aware, I am worried that I've only got a certain bag of tricks, and when I run out of those tricks, what am I going to do? How am I going to construct this? And how am I going to, is it going to take me a long time to sort of learn that process of what else I need to do? So I think that's the downside. And I think the other good thing about, sorry, the other bad thing about not perhaps being part of a class is kind of that peer review. Because I think if you're in the right class, with great peers, I think it can be a really formative process. I remember going to a con one year and seeing a Clarion class getting together. Clarion's the US based writing class. There's I think there's one on each coast, and watching them get together, it was like watching family.
Hmm.
And they clearly just had really bonded over that whole process. They'd looked at each other's stories, they'd learned together, they were supporting each other going forward, which is amazing. But for me, I think I've kind of got, I think I had a morbid fear of embarrassment. Even now, I've kind of got to the point where I will show my partially finished work to people that I trust. But the thought of having to do that even sort of 5 years ago and get up in front of a class and
Hmm.
read out a rough draft of what I've written just would paralyze me with fear, I think. I think you've got to be, I think for me, I remember doing, and this is going to sound pathetic maybe to some people, but I remember doing art GCSE, and it went from loving a subject in that year to hating it because I felt like the teacher wanted me to move in a certain way and in a certain direction, and I felt quite stifled. And I
Yeah.
felt like I had to unlearn a lot of my own sense of self around art. Not that I was a great artist, but I just wanted to do it because I loved it. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to have fun. And the thought of somebody taking the fun out of it
Hmm.
and fitting me into a mold, I found quite terrifying.
Yeah.
So when I gained a little bit of ground in writing, and I was at that point of do I do some sort of formal course or not? I just didn't want to.
Yeah.
I think it's teacher dependent, isn't it? I don't know what
Yeah.
you feel. I think the wrong teacher could probably destroy you, and I know that's happened for people.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Yeah, I think the people that come from a non sort of academic background in terms of writing, they tend to be the more original ones. I mean, again, it's sort of a broad stroke, isn't it? On a brush, but yeah, it's difficult. Again, it's down to the person, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that whole idea, and you see it in art as well, outside of art, you'll see
Yeah.
something that just looks completely unlike anything else, and you think, where the hell has that come from? That's brilliant.
Do you think that now that you are a writer and you've been a really good writer for a few years now, do you think that's changed the way you read? I mean, do you criticize things, or do you sort of not criticize, critique things in any way when you're reading?
I mean, I always, I feel like I've got so much to learn. So I don't think I don't think I'll ever arrive at that point where I think of myself as good. I'm always learning. I think something I have a reading diary,
Hmm.
and I make notes on everything. I don't know why I'm showing you this, you can't see it, but I make notes on everything that I read. When I read a beautiful sentence or a passage, I diarise it. And the whole process of rewriting a really great passage makes me think about the language and the structure of it. There are things that I've read where I think I really don't like this. I think you start to learn to look at things with a critical eye. And I would never say something is terrible or bad. I would say I don't like the way they've done that. I don't. That doesn't work for me, and that is a learning point in itself. As
Hmm.
much as this is a brilliant bit of work, look at the way that's structured. Yeah, I think it has changed how I've read. I don't know as well if it's um, social media and reducing my attention span. I'm certainly reading shorter books, and I don't know if it goes back to the brevity thing, but I really admire a short, concise book. But I'm a little bit worried that reflects my attention span. I mean, recently I finally got stuck into the last of the Hilary Mantel novels about Cromwell. And to be able to get through that actually made me think, oh, thank God for that. I haven't totally lost it. I think there are a lot of the bigger books that I read that are perhaps, I wouldn't say airport novel, but are just, you know, these bigger kind of sweeping novels that I just want to, I look at passages and think, why is that in there? But I think it harks back to how I write, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think maybe I am getting more critical, and I don't really want to be critical, because as a reader first, I want to enjoy every experience. I don't like starting a novel and thinking I'm not enjoying this.
Yeah.
You know, it grieves me greatly. I'll be honest with you.
Well, I know you like researching new things. So do you think, I mean, we discussed this again earlier, but it's difficult to pin down you in a particular genre. What I'm trying to get at is, do you think you'd ever change genre to be sort of more sci-fi or, you know, anything like that?
I think I'm known best for horror, but a lot of the uncollected stuff that I've done, it veers into, there's a little bit of sci-fi, alternative fantasy, not really high fantasy, but there's quite a lot of fantasy, and again, difficult to define kind of stories in there. And I'm finding those obviously difficult to collect. I don't know if I'll ever get a second short story collection at any point. So I think I have always sort of coloured outside the lines a little bit anyway.
Yeah.
And I have fallen foul of it quite a lot. I mean, there were times in the past when I've been invited to submit where, and I don't mind saying this, Ellen Datlow was doing a sea horror, and she read what I sent her and said, this is a lovely, dark coming of age novel, but it's not horror.
Right.
So I'm not going to take it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But the story sometimes just goes where it needs to go. As you know, obviously that's not great financially if you then can't sell it. But you know, it is what it is, and that's, I suppose, for the joy for me of not being a pro full-time writer.
Yeah.
I can afford to make those mistakes.
How much freedom do you give your characters as well? So let's say you start with an idea for a story, you start writing it, and then you sort of realize that the character probably wouldn't, you know, be like that.
Yeah.
Do you let them?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because if you've got a character that is that strong, that they're saying to you, "This is a load of rubbish. I'm not going to do this." Get out of their way and let them do what they want to do, because that's your story. And it's happened quite a few times. I wrote a story called The Firebrand for a horror. Again, it was Alan Datlow, and it's about carnival horror, and it was about this girl who burnt herself up. She could self-immolate, reinvent herself. She was immortal. She started in Salem. She was set on fire but survived it. So she's now part of a 1950s fairground show, and it was about two brothers who were in love with her, and one of them was going to be the villain of the piece, but he didn't want to be, and he wasn't. He wrote my story for me, because when I realised that actually this wasn't going to be a moustache twirling villain, which is very interesting anyway, but someone who very sadly is in love with his brother's wife but doesn't want to be, it sort of changed everything.
Yeah.
And the same with the story that I'm probably known best for is Fabulous Beast.
Yeah.
And that started as a short story originally for a new fairy tale anthology, and I couldn't get it to work, so I parked it and I wrote something else. But when I came back to it, I realised that the two girls that it featured, they didn't want to be saved by a hero. These two girls who lived in a modern tower block in a modern tower, who were princesses, they didn't want to be subject to a prince, and because the other thought I was thinking about Angela Carter, about their mother swooping in and saving them, and ultimately they loved each other and they wanted to save themselves. So they completely dictated that story to me. Once I realised that, that changed everything for those characters.
Interesting.
So yeah, if that ever happens, my advice is just go with it. For God's sake, you've got a strong character there. Follow them. Let them do the heavy lifting.
Yeah. And what are you working on now? Are you allowed to tell us?
I've just without giving too much away, I've just had a story accepted by Johnny Mains for a Titan anthology called Bound in Blood, and that's called The Witch's Pillow Book.
Right.
And it was very inspired by Barrows and I think folk. I think folk horror is probably an overused term these days, but I hope it's in the realm of folk horror. So I'm really excited about that. That's out in September.
Yeah.
And I've just had another story accepted today, which is a
Brilliant.
lovely bit of news. And without giving too much away, I did a lot of research. I actually went to see a couple of undertakers for that one.
Right.
I can't say more, but that was fascinating. Both family businesses. I really wanted to see family undertakers rather than the sort of, the co-op or big companies at work. So these were businesses that have been in the generations within family, the last few generations of a family. So talking to them about their process and how it affected them as children was fascinating.
Ah.
So I loved that. They were very generous, both of them very generous with their time. So not just about the technical aspects of it, but about having that as a family business and what it's like having to drop everything on Christmas Day because mum and dad have to go and pick up a body and look after a grieving family and what that involved. And also at a time when they were young, it was in the 70s again, less health and safety, kids were running around in morgues and things like that. So, yeah, fascinating stuff, definitely. So yeah, and I'm about to start on my next one. That's what I've been doing today. And all I'll say is it's about sunlight. And
Right.
it's proven to be a bit slippery. And I think I've got to be careful. It's one of those stories that could veer off into SF when I need to push it back into horror. So maybe it needs to be more of a I'm trying to think of a good SF horror here, but maybe it needs to be more less Arrival and more Alien here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I need to tinker with that definitely.
Well, thanks again for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting chat.
Sean, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks again. You take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye bye.